Book 2, Chapter 1. He was standing in a wild, bare country. Something about it seemed vaguely familiar. The land rose and fell in dull and weary undulations, in a vast circle of dun ploughland and grey meadow, bounded by a dim horizon, without promise or hope, dreary as a prison wall. The infinite melancholy of an autumn evening brooded heavily over all the world, and the sky was hidden by livid clouds. It all brought back to him some far-off memory, and yet he knew that he gazed on that sad plain for the first time. There was a deep and heavy silence over all, a silence unbroken by so much as the fluttering of a leaf. The trees seemed of a strange shape, and strange were the stunted thorns dotted about the broken field in which he stood. A little path at his feet, bordered by the thorn bushes, wandered away to the left into the dim twilight. It had about it some indefinable air of mystery, as if it must lead one down into a mystic region where all earthly things are forgotten and lost forever. He sat down beneath the bare, twisted boughs of a great tree and watched the dreary land grow darker and yet darker. He wondered, half-consciously, where he was and how he had come to that place, remembering, faintly, tales of like adventure. A man passed by a familiar wall one day, and opening a door before unnoticed, found himself in a new world of unsurmised and marvelous experiences. Another man shot an arrow farther than any of his friends, and became the husband of the fairy. Yet this was not fairyland. These were rather the sad fields and unhappy graves of the underworld than the abode of endless pleasures and undying delights. And yet in all that he saw there was a promise of great wonder. Only one thing was clear to him. He knew that he was Ambrose, that he had been driven from great and unspeakable joys into miserable exile and banishment. He had come from a far, far place by a hidden way, and darkness had closed about him, and bitter drink and deadly meat were given him, and all gladness was hidden from him. This was all he could remember, and now he was astray. He knew not how or why, in this wild, sad land, and the night descended dark upon him. Suddenly there was, as it were, a cry far away in the shadowy silence, and the thorn bushes began to rustle before a shrilling wind that rose as the night came down. At this summons the heavy clouds broke up and dispersed, fleeting across the sky, and the pure heaven appeared with the last rose flush of the sunset dying from it, and there shone the silver light of the evening star. Ambrose's heart was drawn up to this light as he gazed. He saw that the star grew greater and greater. It advanced towards him through the air. Its beams pierced to his soul as if they were the sound of a silver trumpet. An ocean of white splendor flowed over him. He dwelt within the star. It was but for a moment. He was still sitting beneath the tree of the twisted branches, but the sky was now clear and filled with a great peace. The wind had fallen, and a more happy light shone on the great plain. Ambrose was thirsty, and then he saw that beside the tree there was a well, half hidden by the arching roots that rose above it. The water was still and shining, as though it were a mirror of black marble, and marking the brim was a great stone, on which were cut the letters, Fons Vitae Immortalis. He rose, and, bending over the well, put down his lips to drink, and his soul and body were filled as with a flood of joy. Now he knew that all his days of exile he had borne with pain and grief, a heavy, weary body. There had been dolours in every limb, and achings in every bone. His feet had dragged upon the ground, slowly, warily, as the feet of those who go in chains. But dim, broken spectres miserable shapes and crooked images of the world had his eyes seen, for they were bleared with sickness, darkened by the approach of death. Now, indeed, he clearly beheld the shining vision of things immortal. He drank great draughts of the dark glittering water, drinking, it seemed, the light of the reflected stars, and he was filled with life. Every sinew, every muscle, every particle of the deadly flesh shuddered and quickened in the communion of that well water. The nerves and veins rejoiced together. All his being leapt with gladness, and as one finger touched another, as he still bent over the well, a spasm of exquisite pleasure quivered and thrilled through his body. His heart throbbed with bliss that was unendurable. Sense and intellect and soul and spirit were, as it were, sublimed into one white flame of delight. And all the while it was known to him that these were but the least of the pleasures of the kingdom, but the overrunnings and base tricklings of the great supernal cup. He saw without amazement that though the sun had set, the sky now began to flush and redden as if with the northern light. It was no longer the evening, no longer the time of the procession of the dusky night. The darkness, doubtless, had passed away in mortal hours, while for an infinite moment he tasted immortal drink. And perhaps one drop of that water was endless life. But now it was the preparation for the day. He heard the words, Dies venit, dies tua, in quoa reflorent omnia. They were uttered within his heart, and he saw that all was being made ready for a great festival. Over everything there was a hush of expectation, and as he gazed, he knew that he was no longer in that weary land of dun ploughland and grey meadow, of the wild bare trees and strange stunted thorn bushes. He was on a hillside, lying on the verge of a great wood. Beneath, in the valley, a brook sang faintly under the leaves of the silvery willows, and beyond, far in the east, a vast wall of rounded mountain rose serene towards the sky. All about him was the green world of the leaves, odors of the summer night, deep in the mystic heart of the wood, odors of many flowers, and the cool breath rising from the singing stream mingled in his nostrils. The world whitened to the dawn, and then, as the light grew clear, the rose clouds blossomed in the sky, and, answering, the earth seemed to glitter with rose-red sparks and glints of flame. All the east became as a garden of roses. Red flowers of living light shone over the mountain, and as the beams of the sun lit up the circle of the earth, a bird's song began from a tree within the wood. Then were heard the modulations of a final and exultant ecstasy, a chant of liberation, a magistral in exitu. There was the melody of rejoicing trills, of unwearied glad reiterations of choirs ever aspiring, prophesying the coming of the great feast, singing the eternal antiphon. As the song aspired into the heights, so there aspired suddenly before him the walls and pinnacles of a great church set upon a high hill. It was far off, and yet, as though it were close at hand, he saw all the delicate and wonderful imagery cut in its stones. The great door in the west was a miracle. Every flower and leaf, every reed and fern, were clustered in the work of the capitals, and in the round arch above moulding within moulding showed all the beasts that God has made. He saw the rose window, a maze of fretted tracery, the high lancets of the fair hall, the marvellous buttresses, set like angels about this holy house, whose pinnacles were as a place of many springing trees. And high above the vast, far-lifted vault of the roof rose up the spire, golden in the light. The bells were ringing for the feast. He heard from within the walls the roll and swell and triumph of the organ. O pios, o bonos, o placidus, sonos hymnos eorum. He knew not how he had taken his place in the great procession, how, surrounded by ministrants in white, he too bore his part in endless litanies. He knew not through what strange land they passed in their fervent, admirable order, following their banners and their symbols that glanced on high before them. But that land stood ever, it seemed, in a clear, still air, crowned with golden sunlight. And so there were those who bore great torches of wax, strangely and beautifully adorned with golden and vermilion ornaments. The delicate flame of these tapers burned steadily in the still sunlight, and the glittering silver censers, as they rose and fell, tossed a pale cloud into the air. They delayed now and again by wayside shrines, giving thanks for unutterable compassions, and, advancing anew, the blessed company surged onward, moving to its unknown goal in the far blue mountains that rose beyond the plain. There were faces and shapes of awful beauty about him. He saw those in whose eyes were the undying lamps of heaven, about whose heads the golden hair was as an aureole. And there were they that, above the girded vesture of white, wore dyed garments, and as they advanced, around their feet there was the likeness of dim flames. The great white array had vanished, and he was alone. He was tracking a secret path that wound in and out through the thickets of a great forest, by solitary pools of still water, by great oaks, worlds of green leaves, by fountains and streams of water, by the bubbling, mossy sources of the brooks. He followed this hidden way, now climbing and now descending, but still mounting upward, still passing, as he knew, farther and farther from all habitations of men. Through the green boughs now he saw the shining sea-water. He saw the land of the old saints, all the divisions of the land that men had given to them for God. He saw their churches, and it seemed as if he could hear, very faintly, the noise of the ringing of their holy bells. Then, at last, when he had crossed the old road, and had gone by the lightning-struck land and the fisherman's well, he found, between the forest and the mountain, a very ancient and a little chapel. And now he heard the bell of the saint ringing clearly, and so sweetly that it was, as it were, the singing of the angels. Within it was very dark, and there was silence. He knelt and saw scarcely that the chapel was divided into two parts by a screen that rose up to the round roof. There was a glinting of shapes, as if golden figures were painted on this screen, and through the joinings of its beams there streamed out thin needles of white splendor, as if within there was a light greater than that of the sun at noonday. And the flesh began to tremble, for all the place was filled with the odors of paradise. And he heard the ringing of the holy bell, and the voices of the choir that sang out the fairy birds of Rhiannon, crying and proclaiming, "Glory and praise to the conqueror of death, to the fountain of life unending." 9 times they sang this anthem, and then the whole place was filled with blinding light. For a door in the screen had been opened, and there came forth an old man, all in shining white, on whose head was a gold crown. Before him went one who rang the bell. On each side there were young men with torches, and in his hands he bore the mystery of mysteries, wrapped about in veils of gold and of all colors, so that it might not be discerned. And so he passed before the screen, and the light of heaven burst forth from that which he held. Then he entered in again by a door that was on the other side, and the holy things were hidden. And Ambrose heard from within an awful voice, and the words, "Woe and great sorrow are on him, for he hath looked unworthily into the tremendous mysteries, and on the secret glory which is hidden from the holy angels." Chapter 2. Poetry is the only possible way of saying anything that is worth saying at all. This was an axiom that, in later years, Ambrose Merrick's friends were forced to hear at frequent intervals. He would go on to say that he used the term poetry in its most liberal sense, including in it all mystic or symbolic prose, all painting and statuary that was worthy to be called art, all great architecture, and all true music. He meant, it is to be presumed, that the mysteries can only be conveyed by symbols. Unfortunately, however, he did not always make it quite clear that this was the proposition that he intended to utter, and thus offense was sometimes given, as, for example, to the scientific gentleman who had been brought to Merrick's rooms and went away early, wondering audibly and sarcastically whether your clever friend wanted to metrify biology and set Euclid to box organ fugues. However, the great axiom, as he called it, was the justification that he put forward in defense of the notes on which the previous section is based. Of course, he would say, the symbolism is inadequate, but that is the defect of speech of any kind when you have once ventured beyond the multiplication table and the jargon of the stock exchange. Inadequacy of expression is merely a minor part of the great tragedy of humanity. Only an ass thinks that he has succeeded in uttering the perfect content of his thought without either excess or defect. Then again, he might go on, the symbolism would very likely be misleading to a great many people, but what is one to do? I believe many good people find Turner mad and Dickens tiresome. And if the great sometimes fail, what hope is there for the little? We cannot all be, popular novelists of the day. Of course, the notes in question were made many years after the event they commemorate. They were the man's translation of all the wonderful and inexpressible emotions of the boy, and, as Merrick puts it, many words or symbols are used in them which were unknown to the lad of 15. Nevertheless, he said, they are the best words that I can find. As has been said, the old Grange was a large, roomy house. A space could easily have been found for half a dozen more boys if the high usher had cared to be bothered with them. As it was a favor to be at Horbury's, and there was usually some personal reason for admission. Pelly, for example, was the son of an old friend. Bates was a distant cousin, and Rawson's father was the master of a small grammar school in the north with which certain ancestral Horburys were somehow connected. The old Grange was a fine, large Caroline house. It had a grey front of red brick, mellowed with age, tier upon tier of tall, narrow windows, flush with the walls, and a high-pitched, red-tiled roof. Above the front door was a rich and curious wooden penthouse, deeply carven, and within there was plenty of excellent panelling and some good mantelpieces, added, it would seem, somewhere about the Adam period. Horbury had seen its solid and comfortable merits, and had bought the freehold years before at a great bargain. The school was increasing rapidly even in those days, and he knew that before long more houses would be required. If he left Lupton, he would be able to let the old Grange easily. He might almost put it up for auction, and the rent would represent a return of 50% on his investment. Many of the rooms were large, of a size out of all proportion to the boy's needs, and at a very trifling expense, partitions might be made and the 9 or 10 available rooms be subdivided into studies for 20 or even 25 boys. Nature had gifted the high usher with a careful, provident mind in all things, both great and small, and it is but fair to add that on his leaving Lupton for Wareham, he found his anticipations more than justified. To this day, Charles Horbury, his nephew, a high government official, draws a comfortable income from his uncle's most prudent investment, and the house easily holds its 25 boys. Rainey, who took the place from Horbury, was an ingenious fellow, and hit upon a capital plan for avoiding the expense of making new windows for some of the subdivided studies. After thoughtful consideration, he caused the wooden partitions which were put up to stop short of the ceiling by 4 inches, and by this device the study with a window lighted the study that had none, and, as Rainey explained to some of the parents, a diffused light was really better for the eyes than a direct one. In the old days, when Ambrose Merrick was being made a man of, the 4 boys rattled, as it were, in the big house. They were scattered about in odd corners, remote from each other, and it seemed from everybody else. Merrick's room was the most isolated of any, but it was also the most comfortable in winter, since it was over the kitchen, to the extreme left of the house. This part, which was hidden from the road by the boughs of a great cedar, was an afterthought, a Georgian addition in grey brick, and rose only to 2 stories, and in the one furnished room out of the 3 or 4 over the kitchen and offices slept Ambrose. He wished his days could be as quiet and retired as his nights. He loved the shadows that were about his bed even on the brightest mornings in summer, for the cedar boughs were dense, and ivy had been allowed to creep about the panes of the window, so the light entered dim and green, filtered through the dark boughs and the ivy tendrils. Here, then, after the hour of 10 each night, he dwelt secure. Now and again Mr. Horbury would pay nocturnal surprise visits to see that all lights were out, but happily the stairs at the end of the passage, being old and badly fitted, gave out a succession of cracks like pistol shots if the softest foot was set on them. It was simple, therefore, on hearing the first of these reports, to extinguish the candle in the small secret lantern, held warily so that no gleam of light should appear from under the door, and to conceal the lantern under the bedclothes. One wetted one's finger and pinched at the flame, so there was no smell of the expiring snuff, and the lantern slide was carefully drawn to guard against the possibility of suspicious grease marks on the linen. It was perfect, and old Horbury's visits, which were rare enough, had no terrors for Ambrose. So that night, while the venom of the cane still rankled in his body, though it had ceased to disturb his mind, instead of going to bed at once, according to the regulations, he sat for a while on his box, seeking a clue in a maze of odd fancies and conceits. He took off his clothes and wrapped his aching body in the rug from the bed, and presently, blowing out the official paraffin lamp, he lit his candle, ready at the first warning creak on the stairs to douse the glim and leap between the sheets. Odd enough were his first cogitations. He was thinking how very sorry he was to have hit Pelly that savage blow, and to have endangered Rawson's eyesight by the hard boards of the dictionary. This was eccentric, for he had endured from these 2 young Apaches every extremity of unpleasantness for upwards of a couple of years. Pelly was not by any means an evil lad. He was stupid and beefy, within and without, and the great public school system was transmuting him, in the proper course and by the proper steps, into one of those brave, average boobies whom Merrick used to rail against afterwards. Pelly, in all probability, his fortunes not having been traced, went into the army and led the milder and more serious subalterns the devil's own life. In India he lay doggo with great success against some hill tribe armed with 17th century muskets and rather barbarous knives. He seemed to have been present at that Conference of the Powers described so brightly by Mr. Kipling. Promoted to a captaincy, he fought with conspicuous bravery in South Africa, winning the Victoria Cross for his rescue of a wounded private at the instant risk of his own life, and he finally led his troops into a snare set by an old farmer. A rabbit of average intelligence would have smelt and evaded it. For Rawson, one is sorry, but one cannot, in conscience, say much that is good, though he has been praised for his tact. He became domestic chaplain to the Bishop of Dorchester, whose daughter, Emily, he married. But in those old days there was very little to choose between them. From Merrick's point of view, each had displayed a quite devilish ingenuity in the art of annoyance, in the whole cycle of jeers and sneers and scores, as known to the schoolboy, and they were just proceeding to more active measures. Merrick had borne it all meekly. He had returned kindly and sometimes quaint answers to the unceasing stream of remarks that were meant to wound his feelings, to make him look a fool before any boys that happened to be about. He had only countered with a mild, "What do you do that for, Pelly?" when the brave one smacked his head. "Because I hate sneaks and funks," Pelly had replied, and Merrick said no more. Rawson took a smaller size in victims when it was a question of physical torments, but he had invented a most offensive tale about Merrick, and had told it all over the school, where it was universally believed. In a word, the two had done their utmost to reduce him to a state of utter misery. And now he was sorry that he had punched the nose of one and bombarded the other with a dictionary. The fact was that his forbearance had not been all cowardice. It is indeed doubtful whether he was in the real sense a coward at all. He went in fear, it is true, all his days, but what he feared was not the insult, but the intention, the malignancy of which the insult or the blow was the outward sign. The fear of a mad bull is quite distinct from the horror in which most people look upon a viper. It was the latter feeling which made Merrick's life a burden to him. And again there was a more curious shade of feeling, and that was the intense hatred that he felt to the mere thought of scoring off an antagonist, of beating down the enemy. He was a much sharper lad than either Rawson or Pelly. He could have retorted again and again with crushing effect, but he held his tongue, for all such victories were detestable to him. And this odd sentiment governed all his actions and feelings. He disliked going up in form. He disliked winning a game, not through any acquired virtue, but by inherent nature. Poe would have understood Merrick's feelings, but then the author of The Imp of the Perverse penetrated so deeply into the inmost secrets of humanity that Anglo-Saxon criticism has agreed in denouncing him as a wholly inhuman writer. With Merrick, this mode of feeling had grown stronger by provocation. The more he was injured, the more he shrank from the thought of returning the injury. In a great measure, the sentiment remained with him in later life. He would sally forth from his den in quest of fresh air on top of an omnibus, and stroll peacefully back again, rather than struggle for victory with the furious crowd. It was not so much that he disliked the physical contest. He was afraid of getting a seat. Quite naturally, he said that people who pushed, in the metaphorical sense, always reminded him of the hungry little pigs fighting for the largest share of the wash. But he seemed to think that, whereas this course of action was natural in the little pigs, it was profoundly unnatural in the little men. But in his early boyhood he had carried this secret doctrine of his to its utmost limits. He had assumed, as it were, the role of the coward and the funk. He had, without any conscious religious motive certainly, but in obedience to an inward command, endeavored to play the part of a primitive Christian, of a religious in a great public school. Amanescere et pro nihilo astemare. The maxim was certainly in his heart, though he had never heard it. But perhaps if he had searched the whole world over, he could not have found a more impossible field for its exercise than this seminary, where the broad, liberal principles of Christianity were taught in a way that satisfied the press, the public, and the parents. And he sat in his room and grieved over the fashion in which he had broken this discipline. Still, something had to be done. He was compelled to stay in this place, and he did not wish to be reduced to the imbecility of wretched little Phipps, who had become at last more like a whimpering kitten with the mange than a human being. One had not the right to allow oneself to be made an idiot, so the principle had to be infringed, but externally only, never internally. Of that he was firmly resolved, and he felt secure in his recollection that there had been no anger in his heart. He resented the presence of Pelly and Rawson, certainly, but in the manner with which some people resent the presence of a cat, a mouse, or a black beetle, as disagreeable objects which can't help being disagreeable objects. But his bashing of Pelly and his smashing of Rawson, his remarks, gathered from careful observation by the banks of the Lupton and Birmingham Canal, all this had been but the means to an end, the securing of peace and quiet for the future. He would not be murdered by this infernal public school system either, after the fashion of Phipps, which was melancholy, or after the fashion of the rest, which was more melancholy still, since it is easier to recover from nervous breakdown than from suffusion of cant through the entire system, mental and spiritual. Utterly from his heart he abjured and renounced all the horrible shibboleths of the school, its sham enthusiasm, its ethos, its tone, its loyal cooperation, masters and boys working together for the good of the whole school, all its ridiculous fetish conventions and absurd observances, the joint contrivances of young fools and old knaves. But his resistance should be secret and not open. For a while there should be no more bashing than was absolutely necessary. And one thing he resolved upon. He would make all he could out of the place. He would work like a tiger, and get all the Latin and Greek and French obtainable, in spite of the teaching and its imbecile pedantry. The school work must be done, so that trouble might be avoided. But here at night in his room, he would really learn the languages they pottered over in form, wasting half their time in writing sham Ciceronian prose, which would have made Cicero sick, and verse evil enough to cause Virgil to vomit. Then there was French, taught chiefly out of pompous 18th-century fooleries, with lists of irregular verbs to learn, and Babylonish nonsense about the past participle, and many other rotten formulas and rules, giving to the whole tongue the air of a tiresome puzzle, which had been dug up out of a prehistoric grave. This was not the French that he wanted. Still, he could write out irregular verbs by day, and learn the language at night. He wondered whether unhappy French boys had to learn English out of the Rambler, Blair's Sermons, and Young's Night Thoughts. For he had some sort of smattering of English literature which a public schoolboy has no business to possess. So he went on with this mental tirade of his. One is not overwise at 15. It is true enough, perhaps, that the French of the average English schoolboy is something fit to move only pity and terror. It may be true also that nobody except deans and schoolmasters seem to bring away even the formulas and sacred teachings, such as the optative mystery and the doctrine of dumb, of the two great literatures. There is, doubtless, a good deal to be said on the subject of the public schoolman's knowledge of the history and literature of his own country. An infinite deal of comic stuff might be got out of his views and acquirements in the great science of theology. Still, let us say, Floreat. Merrick turned from his review of the wisdom of his elders and instructors to more intimate concerns. There were a few cuts of that vigorous cane which still stung and hurt most abominably, for skill or fortune had guided Mr. Horbury's hand, so that he had been enabled here and there to get home twice in the same place, and there was one particular wheal on the left arm where the flesh, purple and discolored, had swelled up and seemed on the point of bursting. It was no longer with rage, but with a kind of rapture, that he felt the pain and smarting. He looked upon the ugly marks of the high usher's evil humours as though they had been a robe of splendour. For he knew nothing of that bad sherry, nothing of the head's conversation. He knew that when Pelly had come in quite as late, it had only been a question of 100 lines, and so he persisted in regarding himself as a martyr in the cause of those famous Norman arches, which was the cause of that dear dead enthusiast, his father, who loved Gothic architecture and all other beautiful, unpractical things with an undying passion. As soon as Ambrose could walk, he had begun his pilgrimages to hidden mystic shrines. His father had led him over the wild lands to places known perhaps only to himself, and there, by the ruined stones, by the smooth hillock, had told the tale of the old vanished time, the time of the old saints. Chapter 3. It was for this blessed and wonderful learning, he said to himself, that he had been beaten, that his body had been scored with red and purple stripes. He remembered his father's oft-repeated exclamation, "Cithral sais." He understood that the phrase damned not Englishmen qua Englishmen, but Anglo-Saxonism, the power of the creed that builds Manchester, that does business, that invents popular dissent, representative government, adulteration, suburbs, and the public school system. It was, according to his father, the creed of the prince of this world, the creed that made for comfort, success, a good balance at the bank, the praise of men, the sensible and tangible victory and achievement, and he bade his little boy, who heard everything and understood next to nothing, fly from it, hate it and fight against it as you would fight against the devil. And, he would add, it is the only devil you are ever likely to come across. And the little Ambrose had understood not much of all this, and if he had been asked, even at 15, what it all meant, he would probably have said that it was a great issue between Norman Mouldings and Mr. Horbury, an Armageddon of Selden Abbey versus Rocker. Indeed, it is doubtful whether old Nicholas Merrick would have been very much clearer, for he forgot everything that might be said on the other side. He forgot that Anglo-Saxonism, save in the United States of America, makes generally for equal laws, that civil riot, labor movements, of course, excepted, is more a Celtic than a Saxon vice, that the penalty of burning alive is unknown amongst Anglo-Saxons, unless the provocation be extreme, that Englishmen have substituted indentured labor for the old world horrors of slavery, that English justice smites the guilty rich equally with the guilty poor, that men are no longer poisoned with swift and secret drugs, though somewhat unwholesome food may still be sold very occasionally. Indeed, the old Merrick once told his rector that he considered a brothel a house of sanctity compared with a modern factory, and he was beginning to relate some interesting tales concerning the 3 gracious courtesans of the Isle of Britain when the rector fled in horror. He came from Sydenham, and all this was a nice preparation for Lupton. A wonderful joy, an ecstasy of bliss, swelled in Ambrose's heart as he assured himself that he was a witness, though a mean one, for the old faith, for the faith of secret and beautiful and hidden mysteries, as opposed to the faith of rocker and sticker and mucker, and the thought of the school as an inspiring motive in life, the text on which the head had preached the Sunday before. He bared his arms and kissed the purple swollen flesh, and prayed that it might ever be so, that in body and mind and spirit he might ever be beaten and reviled, and made ridiculous by the sacred things, that he might ever be on the side of the despised and the unsuccessful, that his life might ever be in the shadow of the mysteries. He thought of the place in which he was, of the hideous school, the hideous town, the weary waves of the dun midland scenery bounded by the dim, hopeless horizon, and his soul revisited the fairy hills and woods and valleys of the west. He remembered how, long ago, his father had roused him early from sleep in the hush and wonder of a summer morning. The whole world was still and windless. All the magic odors of the night rose from the earth, and as they crossed the lawn, the silence was broken by the enchanted song of a bird rising from the thorn tree by the gate. A high white vapor veiled the sky, and they only knew that the sun had risen by the brightening of this veil, by the silvering of the woods and the meadows and the water in the rejoicing brook. They crossed the road and crossed the brook in the field beneath, by the old footbridge, tremulous with age, and began to climb the steep hillside that one could see from the windows, and the ridge of the hill once surmounted, the little boy found himself in an unknown land. He looked into deep, silent valleys, watered by trickling streams. He saw still woods in that dreamlike morning air. he saw winding paths that climbed into yet remoter regions. His father led him onward till they came to a lonely height. They had walked scarcely 2 miles, but to Ambrose it seemed a journey into another world, and showed him certain irregular markings in the turf. And Nicholas Merrick murmured, "The cell of Ichted is by the seashore. The 9th wave washes its altar. There is a fair shrine in the land of Morgan. The cell of Dewi is in the city of the legions. 9 altars owe obedience to it. Sovereign is the choir that sings about it. The cell of Kubi is the treasure of Gwent. 9 hills are its perpetual guardians. 9 songs befit the memory of the saint." "See," he said, "there are the 9 hills." He pointed them out to the boy, telling him the tale of the saint and his holy bell, which they said had sailed across the sea from Sion, and had entered the Severn, and had entered the Usk, and had entered the Soar, and had entered the Cantwer. And so one day the saint, as he walked beside the little brook that almost encompassed the hill in its winding course, saw the bell that was made of metal that no man might comprehend, floating under the alders, and crying, "Sant, Sant, Sant, I sail from Sion to Kubi Sant." And so sweet was the sound of that bell, Ambrose's father went on, that they said it was as the joy of angels, Immahadris, and that it must have come not from the earthly, but from the heavenly and glorious Sion. And there they stood in the white morning, on the uneven ground that marked the place where once the saint rang to the sacrifice, where the quickening words were uttered after the order of the old mass of the Britons. And then came the yellow hag of pestilence that destroyed the bodies of the Cymry, then the red hag of Rome that caused their souls to stray. Last is come the black hag of Geneva that sends body and soul quick to hell. No honor have the saints any more. Then they turned home again, and all the way Ambrose thought he heard the bell, as it sailed the great deeps from Sion, crying aloud, "Sant, Sant, Sant," and the sound seemed to echo from the glassy water of the little brook, as it swirled and rippled over the shining stones circling round those lonely hills. So they made strange pilgrimages over the beloved land, going farther and farther afield as the boy grew older. They visited deep wells in the heart of the woods, where a few broken stones, perhaps, were the last remains of the hermitage. Finan Ilar Biscutor, the well of the St. Ilar, the fisherman. Nicholas Merrick would explain, and then would follow the story of Ilar, how no man knew whence he came, or who his parents were. He was found, a little child, on a stone in a river in Armorica, by King Alan, and rescued by him. And ever after they discovered on the stone in the river where the child had lain, every day a great and shining fish lying, and on this fish Ilar was nourished. And so he came with a great company of the saints to Britain, and wandered over all the land. So at last Ilar Sant came to this wood, which people now call St. Hilary's Wood, because they have forgotten all about Ilar. And he was weary with his wandering, and the day was very hot, so he stayed by this well and began to drink. And there on that great stone he saw the shining fish, and so he rested and built an altar and a church of willow boughs, and offered the sacrifice not only for the quick and the dead, but for all the wild beasts of the wood and the streams. And when this blessed Ilar rang his holy bell and began to offer, there came not only the prince and his servants, but all the creatures of the wood. There under the hazel boughs you might see the hare, which flies so swiftly from men, come gently and fall down, weeping greatly on account of the passion of the Son of Mary. And beside the hare, the weasel and the polecat would lament grievously in the manner of penitent sinners. And wolves and lambs together adored the saint's hierurgy, and men have beheld tears streaming from the eyes of venomous serpents when Ilar Agios uttered Caer-Ludd with a loud voice. since the serpent is not ignorant that by its wickedness sorrow came to the whole world. And when, in the time of the holy ministry, it is necessary that frequent hallelujahs should be chanted and vociferated, the saint wondered what should be done, for as yet none in that place was skilled in the art of song. Then was a great miracle, since from all the boughs of the wood, from every bush and from every green tree, there resounded hallelujahs in enchanting and prolonged harmony. Never did the Bishop of Rome listen to so sweet a singing in his church as was heard in this wood. For the nightingale and thrush and blackbird and blackcap and all their companions are gathered together and sing praises to the Lord, chanting distinct notes, and yet concluding in a melody of most ravishing sweetness. Such was the mass of the fishermen. Nor was this all, for one day, as the saint prayed beside the well, he became aware that a bee circled round and round his head, uttering loud buzzing sounds, but not endeavoring to sting him. To be short, the bee went before Elar, and led him to a hollow tree not far off, and straightway a swarm of bees issued forth, leaving a vast store of wax behind them. This was their oblation to the Most High, for from their wax Elar Sant made goodly candles to burn at the offering, and from that time the bee is holy, because his wax makes light to shine upon the gifts. This was part of the story that Ambrose's father read to him, and they went again to see the holy well. He looked at the few broken and uneven stones that were left to distinguish it from common wells, and there in the deep green wood, in the summer afternoon, under the woven boughs, he seemed to hear the strange sound of the saint's bell, to see the woodland creatures hurrying through the undergrowth that they might be present at the offering. The weasel beat his little breast for his sins, the big tears fell down the gentle face of the hare, the adders wept in the dust, and all the chorus of the birds sang, Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. Once they drove a long way from the Werne, going towards the west, till they came to the great mountain, as the people called it. After they had turned from the high road, they went down a narrow lane, and this led them with many windings to a lower ridge of the mountain, where the horse and trap were put up at a solitary tavern. Then they began to toil upward on foot, crossing many glistening and rejoicing streams that rushed out cold from the limestone rock, mounting up and up, through the wet land where the rare orchis grew amongst the rushes, through hazel brakes, through fields that grew wilder as they still went higher, and the great wind came down from the high dome above them. They turned, and all the shining land was unrolled before them. The white houses were bright in the sunlight, and there, far away, was the yellow sea, and the two islands, and the coasts beyond. Nicholas Merrick pointed out a tuft of trees on a hill a long way off, and told his son that the Werne was hidden beyond it. And then they began to climb once more, till they came at last to the line where the fields and hedges ended, and above there was only the wild mountain land. And on this verge stood an old farmhouse with strong walls, set into the rock, sheltered a little from the winds by a line of twisted beeches. The walls of the house were gleaming white, and by the porch there was a shrub covered with bright yellow flowers. Mr. Merrick beat upon the oak door, painted black and studded with heavy nails. An old man, dressed like a farmer, opened it, and Ambrose noticed that his father spoke to him with something of reverence in his voice, as if he were some very great person. They sat down in a long room, but dimly lighted by the thick greenish glass in the quarried window, and presently the old farmer set a great jug of beer before them. They both drank heartily enough, and Mr. Merrick said, "Aren't you about the last to brew your own beer, Mr. Craddock?" "Yes, I be the last of all. They do all like the muck the brewer sends better than crueta." "The whole world likes muck better than good drink now." "You be right, sir. Old days and old ways of our fathers, they be gone for ever. There was a blasted preacher down at the chapel a week or two ago, saying, so they do tell me, that they would all be damned to hell unless they took to ginger beer directly. Yes, indeed, now, and I heard that he should say that a man could do a better day's work on that rot-belly stuff than on good beer. Osh you ever hear of such a liar as that? The old man was furious at the thought of these infamies and follies. His S's hissed through his teeth, and his R's rolled out with fierce emphasis. Mr. Merrick nodded his approval of this indignation. "We have what we deserve," he said. "False preachers, bad drink, the talk of fools all the day long, even on the mountain. What is it like, do you think, in London?" There fell a silence in the long dark room. They could hear the sound of the wind in the beech trees, and Ambrose saw how the boughs were tossed to and fro, and he thought of what it must be like in winter nights, here high upon the great mountain, when the storms swept up from the sea, or descended from the wilds of the north, when the shafts of rain were like the onset of an army, and the winds screamed about the walls. "May we see it?" said Mr. Merrick suddenly. "I did think you had come for that. There be very few now that remember." He went out and returned carrying a bunch of keys. Then he opened a door in the room and warned the young master to take care of the steps. Ambrose, indeed, could scarcely see the way. His father led him down a short flight of uneven stone steps, and they were in a room which seemed at first quite dark, for the only light came from a narrow window high up in the wall, and across the glass there were heavy iron bars. Cradock lit 2 tall candles of yellow wax that stood in brass candlesticks on a table, and as the flame grew clear, Ambrose saw that he was opening a sort of aumbrey constructed in the thickness of the wall. The door was a great slab of solid oak, 3 or 4 inches thick, as one could see when it was opened, and from the dark place within, the farmer took an iron box and set it carefully upon the floor, Mr. Merrick helping him. They were strong men, but they staggered under the weight of the chest. The iron seemed as thick as the door of the cupboard from which it was taken, and the heavy antique lock yielded, with a grating scream, to the key. Inside it there was another box of some reddish metal, which, again, held a case of wood black with age, and from this, with reverent hands, the farmer drew out a veiled and splendid cup, and set it on the table between the 2 candles. It was a bowl-like vessel of the most wonderful workmanship, standing on a short stem. All the hues of the world were mingled on it, all the jewels of the regions seemed to shine from it, and the stem and foot were encrusted with work in enamel of strange and magical colors that shone and dimmed with alternating radiance, that glowed with red fires and pale glories, with the blue of the far sky, the green of the fairy seas, and the argent gleam of the evening star. But before Ambrose had gazed more than a moment, he heard the old man say, in pure Welsh, not in broken English, in a resonant and chanting voice, "Let us fall down and adore the marvelous and venerable work of the Lord God Almighty." To which his father responded, "Agios, agios, agios. Mighty and glorious is the Lord God Almighty, in all his works and wonderful operations. Caer-Ludd, Caer-Ludd, Caer-Ludd." They knelt down, Cradock in the midst, before the cup, and Ambrose and his father on either hand. The holy vessel gleamed before the boy's eyes, and he saw clearly its wonder and its beauty. All its surface was a marvel of the most delicate intertwining lines in gold and silver, in copper and in bronze, in all manner of metals and alloys, and these interlacing patterns, in their brightness, in the strangeness of their imagery and ornament, seemed to enthrall his eyes and capture them, as it were, in a maze of enchantment. And not only the eyes, for the very spirit was wrapped and garnered into that far bright world whence the holy magic of the cup proceeded. Among the precious stones which were set into the wonder was a great crystal, shining with the pure light of the moon. About the rim of it there was an appearance of faint and feathery clouds, but in the center it was a white splendor. And as Ambrose gazed, he thought that from the heart of this jewel there streamed continually a shower of glittering stars, dazzling his eyes with their incessant motion and brightness. His body thrilled with a sudden ineffable rapture. His breath came and went in quick pantings. Bliss possessed him utterly as the three crowned forms passed in their golden order. Then the interwoven sorcery of the vessel became a ringing wood of golden and bronze and silver trees. From every side resounded the clear summons of the holy bells and the exultant song of the fairy birds. He no longer heard the low chanting voices of Cradock and his father as they replied to one another in the forms of some antique liturgy. Then he stood by a wild seashore. It was a dark night, and there was a shrilling wind that sang about the peaks of the sharp rock, answering to the deep voices of the heaving sea. A white moon of 14 days old appeared for a moment in the rift between two vast black clouds, and the shaft of light showed all the savage desolation of the shore, cliffs that rose up into the mountains, into crenellated heights that were incredible, whose bases were scourged by the torrents of hissing foam that were driven against them from the hollow-sounding sea. Then, on the highest of those awful heights, Ambrose became aware of walls and spires, of towers and battlements that must have touched the stars. And in the midst of this great castle there surged up the aspiring vault of a vast church, and all its windows were ablaze with the light so white and glorious that it was as if every pane were a diamond. And he heard the voices of a praising host, or the clamor of golden trumpets and the unceasing choir of the angels. And he knew that this place was the sovereign perpetual choir, Cor-arbennic, into whose secret the deadly flesh may scarcely enter. But in the vision he lay breathless on the floor before the gleaming wall of the sanctuary, while the shadows of the hierurgy were enacted. And it seemed to him that, for a moment of time, he saw in unendurable light the mystery of mysteries pass veiled before him in the image of the slain and risen. For a brief while this dream was broken. He heard his father singing softly, Gigoniant hitat hakimab hakir isprit glan, and the old man answered, Agia trias lisonimus. Then again his spirit was lost in the bright depths of the crystal, and he saw the ships of the saints, without oar or sail, afloat on the fairy sea, seeking the glassy isle. All the whole company of the blessed saints of the Isle of Britain sailed on the adventure. Dawn and sunset, night and morning, their illuminated faces never wavered, and Ambrose thought that at last they saw bright shores in the dying light of a red sun, and there came to their nostrils the scent of the deep apple garths in Avalon, and odors of paradise. When he finally returned to the presence of earthly things, he was standing by his father, while Cradock reverently wrapped the cup in the gleaming veils which covered it, saying as he did so in Welsh, Remain in peace, O holy and divine cup of the Lord. Henceforth I know not whether I shall return to thee or not, but may the Lord vouchsafe me to see thee in the church of the firstborn which is in heaven, on the altar of the sacrifice which is from ages unto ages. Ambrose went up the steps and out into the sunshine on the mountainside with the bewilderment of strange dreams, as a colored mist about him. He saw the old white walls, the yellow blossoms by the porch, above the wild high mountain wall, and below all the dear land of Gwent, happy in the summer air, all its woods and fields, its rolling hills and its salt verge, rich in a golden peace. Beside him the cold water swelled from the earth and trickled from the grey rock, and high in the air an exultant lark was singing. The mountain breeze was full of life and gladness, and the rustling and tossing of the woods, the glint and glimmer of the leaves beneath, made one think that the trees, with every creature, were merry on that day. And in that dark cell, beneath many locks, beneath wood and iron, concealed in golden glittering veils, lay hidden that glorious and awful cup, glass of wonderful vision, portal and entrance of the spiritual place. His father explained to him something of that which he had seen. He told him that the vessel was the holy cup of Tylosant, which he was said to have received from the Lord in the state of paradise, and that when Tylo said Mass, using that chalice, the choir of angels was present visibly, that it was a cup of wonders and mysteries, the bestower of visions and heavenly graces. But whatever you do, he said, do not speak to anyone of what you have seen today, because if you do, the mystery will be laughed at and blasphemed. Do you know that your uncle and aunt in Lupton would say that we were all mad together? That is because they are fools, and in these days most people are fools, and malignant fools too, as you will find out for yourself before you are much older. So always remember that you must hide the secrets that you have seen, and if you do not do so, you will be sorry. Mr. Merrick told his son why old Cradock was to be treated with respect, indeed with reverence. He is just what he looks, he said, an old farmer with a small freehold up here on the mountainside, and, as you heard, his English is no better than that of any other farmer in this country. And, compared with Cradock, the Duke of Norfolk is a man of yesterday. He is of the tribe of Tylo the Saint. He is the last, in direct descent, of the hereditary keepers of the Holy Cup, and his race has guarded that blessed relic for 1,300 years. Remember again that today on this mountain you have seen great marvels which you must keep in silence. Poor Ambrose! He suffered afterwards for his forgetfulness of his father's injunction. Soon after he went to Lupton, one of the boys was astonishing his friends with a brilliant account of the crown jewels, which he had viewed during the Christmas holidays. Everybody was deeply impressed, and young Merrick, anxious to be agreeable in his turn, began to tell about the wonderful cup that he had once seen in an old farmhouse. Perhaps his manner was not convincing, for the boys shrieked with laughter over his description. A monitor who was passing asked to hear the joke, and, having been told the tale, clouted Ambrose over the head for an infernal young liar. This was a good lesson, and it served Ambrose in good stead, when one of the masters, having somehow or other heard the story, congratulated him in the most approved scholastic manner before the whole form on his wonderful imaginative gifts. "I see the budding novelist in you, Merrick," said this sly master. "Besant and Rice will be nowhere when you once begin. I suppose you are studying character just at present. Let us down gently, won't you? To the delighted form. We must be careful, mustn't we, how we behave? Achilles among us taking notes, etc., etc." But Merrick held his tongue. He did not tell his form master that he was a beast, a fool, and a coward, since he had found out that the truth, like many precious things, must often be concealed from the profane. A late vengeance overtook that foolish master. Long years after, he was dining at a popular London restaurant, and all through dinner he had delighted the ladies of his party by the artful mixture of brutal insolence and vulgar chaff with which he had treated one of the waiters, a humble-looking little Italian. The master was in the highest spirits at the success of his persiflage. His voice rose louder and louder, and his offensiveness became almost supernaturally acute. And then he received a heavy earthen casserole, 6 quails, a few small onions, and a quantity of savory but boiling juices, full in the face. The waiter was a Neapolitan. The hours of the night passed on, as Ambrose sat in his bedroom at the old Grange, recalling many wonderful memories, dreaming his dreams of the mysteries, of the land of Gwent and the land of vision, just as his uncle, but a few yards away in another room of the house, was at the same time wrapped into the world of imagination, seeing the new Lupton descending like a bride from the heaven of headmasters. But Ambrose thought of the great mountain, of the secret valleys, of the sanctuaries and hallows of the saints, of the rich carven work of lonely churches hidden amongst the hills and woods. There came into his mind the fragment of an old poem which he loved. In the darkness of old age, let not my memory fail. Let me not forget to celebrate the beloved land of Gwent. If they imprison me in a deep place, in a house of pestilence, still shall I be free when I remember the sunshine upon Meneth mine. There have I listened to the singing of the lark. My soul has ascended with the song of the little bird. The great white clouds were the ships of my spirit, sailing to the haven of the Almighty. Equally to be held in honor is the sight of the great mountain, adorned with the gushing of many waters. Sweet is the shade of its hazel thickets. There a treasure is preserved, which I will not celebrate. It is glorious and deeply concealed. If Tylo should return, if happiness were restored to the Cymry, Dewi and Defric should serve his mass, then a great marvel would be made visible. O blessed and miraculous work! Then should my bliss be as the bliss of angels. I had rather behold this offering than kiss the twin lips of the dark Gwentlian. Dear my land of Gwent, O quam delecta tabernacula! The rivers are like precious golden streams of paradise. Thy hills are as the Mount Sion. Better a grave on Twin Barwim than a throne in the place of the Saxons at Caer-Ludd. And then, by the face of contrast, he thought of the first verse of the great school song, Rocker, one of the earliest of the many poems which his uncle had consecrated to the praise of the dear old school. Once on a time, in the books that bore me, I read that in olden days before me, Lupton town had a wonderful game. It was a game with a noble story. Lupton town was then in its glory. Kings and bishops had brought it fame. It was a game that you all must know, and Rocker they called it long ago. Chorus. Look out for the brooks, or you're sure to drown. Look out for the quarries, or else you're down. That was the way, Rocker to play. Once on a day, that was the way. Once on a day, that was the way that they used to play in Lupton town. Thinking of the two songs, he put out his light, and, wearied, fell into a deep sleep. Chapter 4. The British schoolboy, considered in a genial light by those who have made him their special study, has not been found to be either observant or imaginative. Or rather, it would be well to say that his powers of observation, having been highly specialized within a certain limited tract of thought and experience, bounded mainly by cricket and football, are but faint without those bounds, while it is one of the chiefest works of the system to kill, destroy, smash, and bring to nothing any powers of imagination he may have originally possessed. For if this were not done thoroughly, neither a conservative nor a liberal administration would be possible. The House of Commons itself would cease to exist. The Episcopus var Anglicanus would go the way of the great bustard, a muddling through somehow, which must have been the brightest jewel in the British crown, wrung from King John by the barons, would become a lost art. And since all these consequences would be clearly intolerable, the great public schools have perfected a very thorough system of destroying the imaginative toxin, and few cases of failure have been so far reported. Still, there are facts which not even the densest dullards, the most complete boobies, can help seeing, and a good many of the boys found themselves wondering what was the matter with Merrick when they saw him at chapel on the Sunday morning. The news of his astounding violences, both of act and word, on the night before, had not yet circulated generally. Bates was attending to that department, but hadn't had time to do much so far. and the replies of Pelly and Rawson to enquiries after black eyes and a potato-like nose were surly and misleading. Afterwards, when the tale was told, when Bates, having enlarged the incidents to folklore size, showed Pelly lying in a pool of his own blood, Rawson screaming as with the torments of the lost, and Merrick rolling out oaths, all original and terrible, for the space of a quarter of an hour, then indeed the school was satisfied. It was no wonder if Merrick did look a bit queer after the achievement of such an adventure. The funk of aforetime had found courage. The air of rapture was easily understood. It is probable that if in the nature of things it had been possible for an English schoolboy to meet St. Francis of Assisi, the boy would have concluded that the saint must have just made 200 not out in first-class cricket. But Ambrose walked in a strange light. He had been admitted into worlds undreamed of, and from the first brightness of the sun, when he awoke in the morning in his room at the Grange, it was the material world about him, the walls of stone and brick, the solid earth, the sky itself, and the people who talked and moved and seemed alive. These were the things of vision, unsubstantial shapes, odd and broken illusions of the mind. At 7:30, old Toby, the man of all work at the old Grange, banged at his door and let his clean boots fall with a crash on the boards after the usual fashion. He awoke, sat up in bed, staring about him. But what was this? The four walls, covered with a foolish speckled paper, pale blue and pale brown, the white ceiling, the bare boards with a strip of carpet by the bedside. He knew nothing of all this. He was not horrified, because he knew that it was all non-existent, some plastic fantasy that happened to be presented for the moment to his brain. Even the big black wooden chest that held his books, Parker, despised by Horbury, among them, failed to appeal to him with any sense of reality. And the bird's-eye washstand and chest of drawers, the white water-jug with the blue band, were all frankly phantasmal. It reminded him of a trick he had sometimes played. One chose one's position carefully, shut an eye, and, behold, a mean shed could be made to obscure the view of a mountain. So these walls and appurtenances made an illusory sort of intrusion into the true vision on which he gazed. The yellow washstand rising out of the shining wells of the undying, the speckled walls in the place of the great mysteries, a chest of drawers in the magic garden of roses. It had the air of a queer joke, and he laughed aloud to himself as he realized that he alone knew, that everybody else would say, that is a white jug with a blue band, while he, and he only, saw the marvel and glory of the holy cup with its glowing metals, its interlacing myriad lines, its wonderful images, and its hues of the mountain and the stars, of the green wood and the fairy sea, where, in a shore haven, anchor the ships that are bound for Avalon. For he had a certain faith that he had found the earthly presentation and sacrament of the eternal heavenly mystery. He smiled again with the quaint smile of an angel in an old Italian picture, as he realized more fully the strangeness of the whole position and the odd humors which would relieve to play a wonderful game of make-believe. The speckled walls, for instance, were not really there, but he was to behave just as if they were solid realities. He would presently rise and go through an odd pantomime of washing and dressing, putting on brilliant boots, and going down to various mumbo-jumbo ceremonies called breakfast, chapel, and dinner, in the company of appearances to whom he could accord all the honors due to veritable beings. And this delicious phantasmagoria would go on and on, day after day, he alone having the secret. And what a delight it would be to play up at rocker. It seemed to him that the solid-seeming earth, the dear old school, and rocker itself had all been made to minister to the acuteness of his pleasure. They were the darkness that made the light visible, the matter through which form was manifested. For the moment he enclosed in the most secret place of his soul the true world into which he had been guided, and as he dressed he hummed the favorite school song, Never Mind. If the umpire calls out at your poor second over, if none of your hits ever turns out a rover, if you fumble your fives and go rot over sticker, if every hound is a little bit quicker, if you can't tackle rocker at all, not at all, and kick at the moon when you try for the ball, never mind, never mind, never mind if you fall. Dick falls before rising, Tom short, Harry's tall, never mind. Don't be one of the weakest who go to the wall, never mind. Ambrose could not understand how Columbus could have blundered so grossly. Somehow or other he should have contrived to rid himself of his crew. He should have returned alone with a dismal tale of failure, and passed the rest of his days as that sad and sorry charlatan who had misled the world with his mad whimsies of a continent beyond the waters of the Atlantic. If he had been given wisdom to do this, how great, how wonderful would his joys have been! They would have pointed at him as he paced the streets in his shabby cloak. The boys would have sung songs about him and his madness. The great people would have laughed contemptuously as he went by, and he would have seen in his heart all that vast far world of the West, the rich islands barred by roaring surf, the whole hemisphere of strange regions and a strange people. He would have known that he alone possessed the secret of it. But, after all, Ambrose knew that his was a greater joy even than this, for the world that he had discovered was not far across the seas, but within him. Pelly stared straight before him in savage silence all through breakfast. He was convinced that mere hazard had guided that crushing blow, and he was meditating schemes of complete and exemplary vengeance. He noticed nothing strange about Merrick, nor would he have cared if he had seen the images of the fairies in his eyes. Rawson, on the other hand, was full of genial civility and good fellowship. It was old chap and old fellow, every other word. But he was far from unintelligent, and, as he slyly watched Merrick, he saw that there was something altogether unaccustomed and incomprehensible. Unknown lights burned and shone in his eyes, reflections of one knew not what. The expression was altered in some queer way that he could not understand. Merrick had always been a rather ugly, dogged-looking fellow. His black hair, and something that was not usual in the set of his features, gave him an exotic, almost an oriental appearance. Hence a story of Rawson's to the effect that Merrick's mother was a Negro woman in poor circumstances and of indifferent morality had struck the school as plausible enough. But now the grimness of the rugged features seemed abolished. The face shone, as it were, with the light of a flame. But a flame of what fire? Rawson, who would not have put his observations into such terms, drew his own conclusions readily enough, and imparted them to Pelly after chapel. "Look here, old chap," he said, "did you notice young Merrick at breakfast?" Pelly simply blasted Merrick and announced his intention of giving him the worst thrashing he had ever had at an early date. "Don't you try it on," said Rawson. "I had my eye on him all the time. He didn't see I was spotting him. He's cracked. He's dangerous. I shouldn't wonder if he were in a strait waistcoat in the county lunatic asylum in a week's time. My governor had a lot to do with lunatics, and he always said he can tell by the eyes. I'll swear Merrick is raging mad." "Oh, rot," said Pelly. "What do you know about it?" "Well, look out, old chap, and don't say I didn't give you the tip. Of course, you know a maniac is stronger than 3 ordinary men. The only thing is to get them down and crack their ribs. But you want at least 6 men before you can do it." "Oh, shut up." So Rawson said no more, remaining quite sure that he had diagnosed Ambrose's symptoms correctly. He waited for the catastrophe with a dreadful joy, wondering whether Merrick would begin by cutting old Horbury's throat with his own razor, or whether he would rather steal into Pelly's room at night than tear him limb from limb, a feat which, as a madman, he could of course accomplish with perfect ease. As a matter of fact, neither of these events happened. Pelle, a boy of the bulldog breed, smacked Ambrose's face a day or two later before a huge crowd of boys, and received in return such a terrific blow under the left ear that a formal fight in the Tom Brown manner was out of the question. Pelle reached the ground and stayed there in an unconscious state for some while, and the other boys determined that it would be as well to leave Merrick to himself. He might be cracked, but he was undoubtedly a hard hitter. As for Pelle, like the sensible fellow that he was, he simply concluded that Merrick was too good for him. He did not quite understand it. He dimly suspected the intrusion of some strange forces, but with such things he had nothing to do. It was a fair knockout, and there was an end of it. Bates had glanced up as Ambrose came into the dining room on the Sunday morning. He saw the shining face, the rapturous eyes, and had silently wondered, recognizing the presence of elements which transcended all his calculations. Meanwhile, the Lupton Sunday went on after its customary fashion. At 11 o'clock, the chapel was full of boys. There were nearly 600 of them there, the big ones in frock-coats with high-pointed collars, which made them look like youthful Gladstones. The younger boys wore broad, turned-down collars and had short, square jackets made somewhat in the Basque fashion. Young and old had their hair cut close to the scalp, and this gave them all a brisk but bullety appearance. The masters, in cassock, gown, and hood, occupied the choir stalls. Mr. Horbury, the high usher, clothed in a flowing surplice, was taking morning prayer, and the head occupied a kind of throne by the altar. The chapel was not an inspiring building. It was the 14th century, certainly, but the 14th century translated by 1840, and it is to be feared, sadly betrayed by the translators. The tracery of the windows was poor and shallow, the mouldings of the piers and arches faulty to a degree. The chancel was absurdly out of proportion, and the pitch-pine benches and stalls had a sticky look. There was a stained-glass window in memory of the old Luptonians who fell in the Crimea. One wondered what the woman of Samaria by the well had to do either with Lupton or the Crimea, and the colouring was like that used in very common cheap sweets. The service went with a rush. The prayers, versicles and responses, and psalms were said. The officiant and the congregation, rather pressing than pausing, often indeed coming so swiftly to cues that 2 or 3 words at the end of one verse, or 2 or 3 words at the beginning of the next, would be lost in a confused noise of contending voices. But Venite and Te Deum and Benedictus were rattled off to frisky Anglicans with great spirit. Sometimes the organ tooted, sometimes it bleated gently, like a flock of sheep. Now one might have sworn that the music of penny whistles stole on the ear, and again, as the organist coupled up the full organ, using suddenly all the battery of his stops, a gas explosion and a Salvation Army band seemed to strive against one another. A well-known nobleman who had been to chapel at Lupton was heard to say, with reference to this experience, "I am no ritualist, heaven knows, but I confess I like a hearty service." But it was, above all, the sermon that has made the chapel a place of many memories. The old boys say, and one supposes that they are in earnest, that the tall, dignified figure of the doctor, standing high above them all, his scarlet hood making a brilliant splash of color against the dingy, bilious paint of the pale green walls, has been an inspiration to them in all quarters of the globe, in all manner of difficulties and temptations. One man writes that in the midst of a complicated and dangerous deal on the Stock Exchange, he remembered a sermon of Dr. Chesson's called in the printed volume, "Fighting the Good Fight." "You have a phrase amongst you which I often hear," said the head. "That phrase is 'play the game,' and I wish to say that, though you know it not, though it may be, the words are often spoken half in jest, still they are but your modern boyish rendering of the old stirring message which I have just read to you. Fight the good fight. Play the game. Remember the words in the storm and struggle, the anxiety and stress that may be, nay, must be, before you, etc., etc., etc. After the crisis was over, wrote the Stock Exchange man, I was thankful that I had remembered those words. That voice, sounding like a trumpet on the battlefield, bidding us all remember that success was the prize of effort and endurance. So writes a well-known journalist. I remembered what the doctor said to us once about running the race, says a young soldier, recounting a narrow escape from a fierce enemy, so I stuck to my orders. Ambrose, on that Sunday morning, sat in his place, relishing acutely all the savours of the scene, consumed with inward mirth at the thought that this also professed to be a rite of religion. There was an aimless and flighty merriment about the chant to the Te Deum that made it difficult for him to control his laughter, and when he joined in the hymn, Pleasant are thy courts above, there was an odd choke in his voice that made the boy next to him shuffle uneasily. But the sermon! It will be found on page 125 of the Lupton Sermons. It dealt with the parable of the talents, and showed the boys in what the sin of the man who concealed his talent really consisted. I dare say, said the head, that many of the older amongst you have wondered what this man's sin really was. You may have read your Greek testaments carefully, and then have tried to form in your minds some analogy to the circumstances of the parable, and it would not surprise me if you were to tell me that you had failed. What manner of man was this? I can imagine your saying to one another, I shall not be astonished if you confess that, for you at least, the question seems unanswerable. Yes, unanswerable to you, for you are English boys, the sons of English gentlemen, to whom the atmosphere of casuistry, of concealment, of subtlety is unknown, by whom such an atmosphere would be rejected with scorn. You come from homes where there is no shadow, no dark corner which must not be pried into. Your relations and your friends are not of those who hide their gifts from the light of day. Some of you, perhaps, have had the privilege of listening to the talk of one or other of the great statesmen who guide the doctrines of this vast empire. You will have observed, I am sure, that in the world of politics there is no vain simulation of modesty, no feigned reluctance to speak of worthy achievement. All of you are members of this great community, of which each one of us is so proud, which we think of as the great inspiration and motive force of our lives. Here, you will say, there is no hidden talents, for the note of the English public school, thank God for it, is openness, frankness, healthy emulation, each endeavoring to do his best for the good of all. In our studies and in our games, each desires to excel to carry off the prize. We strive for a corruptible crown, thinking that this, after all, is the surest discipline for the crown that is incorruptible. If a man say that he loveth God whom he hath not seen, and love not his brother whom he hath seen, let your light shine before men. Be sure that we shall never win heaven by despising earth. Yet that man hid his talent in a napkin. What does the story mean? What message has it for us today? I will tell you. Some years ago, during our summer holidays, I was on a walking tour in a mountainous district in the north of England. The sky was of a most brilliant blue. The sun poured, as it were, a gospel of gladness on the earth. Towards the close of day, I was entering a peaceful and beautiful valley amongst the hills, when 3 sullen notes of a bell came down the breeze towards me. There was a pause. Again the 3 strokes, and for a 3rd time this dismal summons struck my ears. I walked on in the direction of the sound, wondering whence it came and what it signified, and soon I saw before me a great pile of buildings, surrounded by a gloomy and lofty wall. It was a Roman Catholic monastery. The bell was ringing the Angelus, as it is called. I obtained admittance to this place, and spoke to some of the unhappy monks. I should astonish you if I mentioned the names of some of the deluded men who had immured themselves in this prison house. It is sufficient to say that among them were a soldier who had won distinction on the battlefield, an artist, a statesman, and a physician of no mean repute. Now, do you understand? A day will come, you know, I think, what the day is called, when these poor men will have to answer the question, where is the talent that was given to you? Where was your sword in the hour of your country's danger? Where was your picture, your consecration of your art to the service of morality and humanity, when the doors of the great exhibition were thrown open? Where was your silver eloquence, your voice of persuasion, when the strife of party was at its fiercest? Where was your God-given skill in healing, when one of royal blood lay fainting on the bed of dire, almost mortal sickness? And the answer, I laid it up in a napkin. And now, etc., etc. Then the whole 600 boys sang O Paradise, with a fervor and sincerity that was irresistible. The organ thundered till the bad glass shivered and rattled, and the service was over. Chapter 5. Almost the last words that Ambrose had heard after his wonderful awaking were odd enough, though at the time he took little note of them, since they were uttered amidst passionate embraces, amidst soft kisses on his poor beaten flesh. Indeed, if these words recurred to him afterwards, they never made much impression on his mind, though to most people they would seem of more serious import than much else that was uttered that night. The sentences ran something like this. The cruel wicked brute, he shall be sorry all his days, and every blow shall be a grief to him. My dear, I promise you he shall pay for tonight 10 times over. His heart shall ache for it till it stops beating. There cannot be much doubt that this promise was kept to the letter. No one knew how wicked rumors concerning Mr. Horbury got abroad in Lupton, but from that very day the execution of the sentence began. In the evening, the high usher, paying a visit to a friend in town, took a short-cut through certain dark, ill-lighted streets, and was suddenly horrified to hear his name shrieked out, coupled with the most disgusting accusation. His heart sank down in his breast. His face, he knew, was bloodless. And then he rushed forward to the mal-passage whence the voice seemed to proceed. There was nothing there. It was a horrid little alley, leading from one slum to another, between low walls and waste back gardens, dismal and lampless. Horbury ran at top speed to the end of it, but there was nothing to be done. A few women were gossiping at their doors. A couple of men slouched past on their way to the beer shop at the corner. That was all. He asked one of the women if she had seen anybody running, and she said no, civilly enough, and yet he fancied that she had leered at him. He turned and went back home. He was not in the mood for paying visits. It was some time before he could compose his mind by assuring himself that the incident, though unpleasant, was not of the slightest significance. But from that day the nets were about his feet, and his fate was sealed. Personally, he was subjected to no further annoyance, and soon forgot that unpleasant experience in the back street. But it seems certain that from that Sunday onwards a cloud of calumny overshadowed the high usher in all his ways. No one said anything definite, but everyone appeared to be conscious of something unpleasant when Horbury's name was mentioned. People looked oddly at one another, and the subject was changed. One of the young masters, speaking to a colleague, did indeed allude casually to Horbury as Xanthius Phocaeus. The other master, a middle-aged man, raised his eyebrows and shook his head without speaking. It is understood that these muttered slanders were various in their nature. But, as has been said, everything was indefinite, intangible as contagion, and as deadly to the master's worldly health. That horrible accusation which had been screamed out of the alley was credited by some. Others agreed with the young master, while a few had a terrible story of an idiot girl in a remote Derbyshire village. And the persistence of all these fables was strange. It was 4 years before Henry Vibart Chesson, D.D., ascended the throne of St. Guthmund at Dorchester, and all through those 4 years the fountain of evil innuendo rose without ceasing. It is doubtful how far belief in the truth of these scandals was firm and settled, or how far they were in the main uttered and circulated by ill-natured people who disliked Horbury, but did not in their hearts believe him guilty of worse sins than pompousness and arrogance. The latter is the more probable opinion. Of course, the deliberations of the trustees were absolutely secret, and the report that the chairman, the Marquis of Dunham, said something about Caesar's wife is a report and nothing more. It is evident that the London press was absolutely in the dark as to the existence of this strange conspiracy of vengeance, since 2 of the chief dailies took the appointment of the high usher to the headmastership as a foregone conclusion, prophesying, indeed, a rule of phenomenal success. And then Millward, a Winchester man, understood to be rather unsound on some scholastic matters, not quite the right man, just a little bit of a Jesuit, received the appointment, and people did begin to say that there must be a screw loose somewhere, and Horbury was overwhelmed and began to die. The odd thing was that, save on that Sunday night, he never saw the enemy. He never suspected that there was an enemy. And as for the incident of the alley, after a little consideration, he treated it with contempt. It was only some drunken beast in the town who knew him by sight and wished to be offensive, in the usual fashion of drunken beasts. And there was nothing else. Lupton society was much too careful to allow its suspicions to be known. A libel action meant, anyhow, a hideous scandal, and might have no pleasant results for the libellers. Besides, no one wanted to offend Horbury, who was suspected of possessing a revengeful temper, and it had not dawned on the Lupton mind that the rumours they themselves were circulating would eventually ruin the high usher's chances of the headmastership. Each gossip heard, as it were, only his own mutter at the moment. He did not realize that when a great many people are muttering all at once, an ugly noise of considerable volume is being produced. It is true that a few of the masters were somewhat cold in their manner. They lacked the social gift of dissimulation, and could not help showing their want of cordiality. But Horbury, who noticed this, put it down to envy and disaffection, and resolved that the large powers given him by the trustees should not be in vain, so far as the masters in question were concerned. Indeed, C.L. Wood, who was afterwards headmaster of Marchester, and died in Egypt a few years ago, had a curious story which in part relates to the masters in question, and perhaps throws some light on the extraordinary tale of Horbury's ruin. Wood was an old Luptonian. He was a mighty athlete in his time, and his records for the long jump and throwing the cricket ball have not been beaten at Lupton to this day. He had been one of the first boarders taken at the old Grange. The early relations between Horbury and himself had been continued in later life, and Wood was staying with his former master at the time when the trustees' decision was announced. It is supposed, indeed, that Horbury had offered him a kind of unofficial but still important position in the new model. In fact, Wood confessed over his port that the idea was that he should be a kind of intelligence department to the head. He did not seem very clear as to the exact scope of his proposed duties. We may certainly infer, however, that they would have been of a very confidential nature, for Wood had jotted down his recollections of that fatal morning somewhat as follows. I never saw Horbury in better spirits. Indeed, I remember thinking that he was younger than ever, younger than he was in the old days when he was a junior master and I was in the third. Of course, he was always energetic. One could not disassociate the two notions of Horbury and energy. I used to make him laugh by threatening to include the two terms in the new edition of my little book, Latin and English Synonyms. It did not matter whether he were taking the fifth or editing classics for his boys or playing rocker. One could not help rejoicing in the vivid and ebullient energy of the man. And perhaps this is one reason why shirkers and loafers dreaded him, as they certainly did. But during those last few days at Lupton, his vitality had struck me as quite superhuman. As all the world knows, his succession to the headmastership was regarded by everyone as assured, and he was, naturally and properly, full of the great task which he believed was before him. This is not the place to argue the merits or demerits of the scheme which he had been maturing for many years in his brain. A few persons who, I cannot but think, have received very imperfect information on the subject, have denounced Horbury's views of the modern public school as revolutionary. Revolutionary they certainly were, as an express engine is revolutionary compared to an ox wagon. But those who think of the late Canon Horbury as indifferent to the good side of public school traditions knew little of the real man. However, were his plans good or bad, they were certainly of vast scope, and on the first night of my visit he made me sit up with him till 2 o'clock while he expounded his ideas, some of which, as he was good enough to say, he trusted to me to carry out. He showed me the piles of manuscript he had accumulated, hundreds of pages relating to the multiple departments of the great organization which he was to direct, or rather to create. Sheets of serried figures, sheaves of estimates which he had caused to be made out in readiness for immediate action. Nothing was neglected. I remember seeing a note on the desirability of compiling a Lupton hymn book for use in the chapel, and another on the question of forming a botanical garden, so that the school botany might be learned from the green life, as he beautifully expressed it, not from dry letterpress and indifferent woodcuts. Then, I think, on a corner of the botany leaf was a jotting, a mere hasty scrawl, waiting development and consideration. Should we teach Hindustani? Write to Tucker regarding the Molvi Ahmad Khan. I despair of giving the reader any conception of the range and minuteness of these wonderful memoranda. I remember saying to Horbury that he seemed to be able to use the microscope and the telescope at the same time. He laughed joyously and told me to wait till he was really at work. "You will have your share, I promise you," he added. His high spirits were extraordinary and infectious. He was an excellent raconteur, and now and again, amidst his talk of the new Lupton, which he was about to translate from the idea into substance, he told some wonderful stories, which I have not the heart to set down here. Tune quaesieris. I have often thought of those lines when I remember Horbury's intense happiness, the nervous energy which made the delay of a day or two seem almost intolerable. His brain and fingers tingled, as it were, to set about the great work before him. He reminded me of a mighty host, awaiting but the glance of their general to rush forward with irresistible force. There was not a trace of misgiving. Indeed, I should have been utterly astonished if I had seen anything of the kind. He told me, indeed, that for some time past he had suspected the existence of a sort of cabal or clique against him. A and X, B and Y, M and N, and, I think, Z, are in it, he said, naming several of the masters. They are jealous, I suppose, and want to make things as difficult as they can. They are all cowards, though, and I don't believe one of them, except perhaps M, would fail in obedience, or rather in subservience, when it comes to the point. But I am going to make short work of the lot. And he told me his intention of ridding the school of these disaffected elements. The trustees will back me up, I know, he added, but we must try to avoid all unnecessary friction. And he explained to me a plan he had thought of before eliminating the masters in question. "It won't do to have half-hearted officers on our ship," was the way in which he put it, and I cordially agreed with him. Possibly he may have underrated the force of the opposition which he treated so lightly. Possibly he altogether misjudged the situation. He certainly regarded the appointment as already made, and this, of course, was, or appeared to be, the conviction of all who knew anything of Lupton and Horbury. I shall never forget the day on which the news came. Horbury made a hearty breakfast, opening letters, jotting down notes, talking of his plans as the meal proceeded. I left him for a while. I was myself a good deal excited, and I strolled up and down the beautiful garden at the old Grange, wondering whether I should be able to satisfy such a chief who, the soul of energy himself, would naturally expect like quality in his subordinates. I rejoined him in the course of an hour in the study, where he was as busy as ever, snowed up, as he expressed it, in a vast pile of papers and correspondence. He nodded genially and pointed to a chair, and a few minutes later a servant came in with the letter. She had just found it in the hall, she explained. I had taken a book and was reading. I noticed nothing till what I can only call a groan of intense anguish made me look up in amazement, indeed, in horror. And I was shocked to see my old friend, his face a ghastly white, his eyes staring into vacancy, and his expression one of the most terrible, the most terrible, that I have ever witnessed. I cannot describe that look. There was an agony of grief and despair, a glance of the wildest amazement, terror as of an impending awful death, and with these the fiercest and most burning anger that I have ever seen on any human face. He held a letter clenched in his hand. I was afraid to speak or move. It was fully 5 minutes before he regained his self-control, and he did this with an effort which was in itself dreadful to contemplate. So severe was the struggle. He explained to me, in a voice which faltered and trembled with the shock that he had received, that he had had very bad news, that a large sum of money, which was absolutely necessary to the carrying out of his projects, had been embezzled by some unscrupulous person, that he did not know what he should do. He fell back into his chair. In a few minutes he had become an old man. He did not seem upset or even astonished when, later in the day, a telegram announced that he had failed in the aim of his life, that a stranger was to bear rule in his beloved Lupton. He murmured something to the effect that it was no matter now. He never held up his head again. This note is an extract from George Horbury, a memoir. It was written by Dr. Wood for the use of a few friends and privately printed in a small edition of 150 copies. The author felt, as he explained in his brief foreword, that by restricting the sale to those who either knew Horbury or were especially interested in his work, he was enabled to dwell somewhat intimately on matters which could hardly have been treated in a book meant for the general public. The extract that has been made from this book is interesting on 2 points. It shows that Horbury was quite unaware of what had been going on for 4 years before Chesson's resignation, and that he had entirely misinterpreted the few and faint omens which had been offered him. He was preparing to break a sulky sentinel or two when all the ground of his fortalice was a very network of loaded mines. The other point is still more curious. It will be seen from Wood's story that the terrific effect that he describes was produced by a letter received some hours before the news of the trustees' decision arrived by telegram. Later in the day is the phrase in the memoir. As a matter of fact, the final deliberation of the Lupton trustees, held at Marshall's Hotel in Albemarle Street, began at 11:30 and was not over till 1:45. It is not likely that the result could have reached the old Grange before 2:15, whereas the letter found in the hall must have been read by Horbury before 10 o'clock. The invariable breakfast hour at the old Grange was 8 o'clock. C.L. says, "I rejoined him in the course of an hour, and the letter was brought in a few minutes later." Afterwards, when the fatal telegram arrived, the memoir notes that the unfortunate man was not even astonished. It seems to follow almost necessarily from these facts that Horbury learnt the story of his ruin from the letter, for it has been ascertained that the High Usher's account of the contents of the letter was false from beginning to end. Horbury's most excellent and sagacious investments were all in the impeccable hands of Whittams, Messrs. Whittam, Venables, Davenport, and Whittam, of Raymond Buildings, Gray's Inn, who do not include embezzlement in their theory and practice of the law, and, as a matter of fact, the nephew, Charles Horbury, came into a very handsome fortune on the death of his uncle, £80,000 in personality, with the old Grange and some valuable ground rents in the new part of Lupton. It is certain as anything can be that George Horbury never lost a penny by embezzlement, or, indeed, in any other way. One may surmise, then, the real contents of that terrible letter. In general, that is, for it is impossible to conjecture whether the writer told the whole story. One does not know, for example, whether Merrick's name was mentioned or not, whether there was anything which carried the reader's mind to that dark evening in November when he beat the white-faced boy with such savage cruelty. But from Dr. Wood's description of the wretched man's appearance, one understands how utterly unexpected was the crushing blow that had fallen upon him. It was a lightning flash from the sky at its bluest, and before that sudden and awful blast, his whole life fell into deadly and evil ruin. He never held up his head again. He never lived again, one may say, unless a ceaseless wheel of anguish and anger and bitter and unavailing and furious regret can be called life. It was not a man, but a shell, full of gall and fire, that went to Wareham, but probably he was not the first of the Clipoth to be made a cannon. As we have no means of knowing exactly what or how much that letter told him, one is not in a position to say whether he recognized the singularity, one might almost say the eccentricity, with which his punishment was stage-managed. Nec Deus intersit, certainly, but a principle may be pushed too far, and a critic might point out that, putting avenging deities in their machines on one side, it was rather going to the other extreme to bring about the great catastrophe by means of bad sherry, a trying headmaster, boiled mutton, a troublesome schoolboy, and a servant-maid. Yet these were the agents employed, and it seems that we are forced to the conclusion that we do not altogether understand the management of the universe. The conclusion is a dangerous one, since we may be led by it, unless great care is exercised, into the worst errors of the Dark Ages. There is the question, of course, of the truthfulness or falsity of the various slanders which had such a tremendous effect. The worst of them were lies, there can be little doubt of that, and as for the rest, it may be hinted that the allusion of the young master to Xanthias Phocaeus was not very far wide of the mark. Mrs. Horbury had been dead some years, and it is to be feared that there had been passages between the High Usher and Nelly Foran which public opinion would have condemned. It would be difficult to tell the whole story, but the girl's fury of revenge makes one apt to believe that she was exacting payment not only for Ambrose's wrongs, but for some grievous injury done to herself. But before all these things could be brought to their ending, Ambrose Merrick had to live in wonders and delights, to be initiated in many mysteries, to discover the meaning of that voice which seemed to speak within him, denouncing him because he had pried unworthily into the secret which is hidden from the holy angels.